Hello from a very autumnal London. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conference. I'm really excited about it, not just because of the focus, but also the format. I'm sure I'm not alone in being really conflicted about air travel, particularly going to conferences. Sorry that this isn't going to be a very tech-savvy presentation. Being hopefully in the last few months of my PhD means that I don't really have much time to play with, so I'm afraid you're stuck with me. What I am going to do is put up some images on the screen at various points to demonstrate what I'm talking about, because I thought it wouldn't be quite right to talk about visual art without showing any. So my PhD focuses on public art interventions about migration, but human migration, and I'm looking at artworks in public spaces in Northern European countries that support migrant solidarity movements and focusing on the main years of the so-called European refugee crisis. These aren't permanent state-sponsored monuments or things like that, but temporary interventions into public spaces that could be classed as activist, though a lot of the artists I've spoken to wouldn't be too comfortable with that. Regardless of how you label them, they have a message or an agenda, and often that's about trying to communicate aspects of this huge global issue of migration in a way that the public see another side to mainstream rhetoric, or that they connect with the issue or think about it in more deeply or in new ways. In fact, that's one of the things that the artists repeat most often about wanting to create situations that encourage people to think more critically, to think more deeply, and to think from other people's perspectives. So ideas around empathy come up time and time again. And I think that's really important when we think about refugees, but I also think it holds true when we think about non-human species as well. And I've just put a few examples up on the screen so you know what I'm going on about. But anyway, this doesn't really have anything to do with the topic of the conference, though of course there are links between climate change and human migration. But I'm explaining it because considering these artworks has made me think about the potential for similar creative outputs about rewilding. Rewilding is a real interest of mine, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that when thinking about the other people taking part in this conference. What I'm fascinated by is its potentials, both in terms of restoring natural processes in ecosystems and also increasing biodiversity and species abundance, and then of course the long-term benefits of a healthier environment. It also holds real potential when we think about ecologically sound economic possibilities and benefits for communities in rural areas, and its ability to mitigate against things like flooding and habitat destruction which have occurred as a result of human intervention, as well as the benefits that experiencing nature has for all of us on a personal level. And if you want to think about it perhaps more cynically, there are economic benefits of less intensive land management as well. I also think there's a responsibility to engage with rewilding. The natural world is not ours to dominate and control, especially when it comes at the detriment of so many species, both flora and fauna, and actually to our own detriment as well. One link I see between rewilding and human migration is the relevance of national borders. Borders can become more or less permeable based on political conditions and based on who or what is seeking to travel across them. So in both cases, these artificial barriers can curtail natural processes of migration. And that is something we often forget, that national borders are not natural, other than perhaps in the case of islands. So, thinking of the EU in particular, because that's the area that I'm researching, national borders have been relaxed for the sake of the European project. Even so, countries reassert their sovereignty when supposed threats reach their shores. In recent years, this has been demonstrated most dramatically through responses to illegal migration. But another form of pseudo-illegal migration also produces anxieties, this being the movement of animals reintroduced into one country that then make their way naturally over these artificial boundaries. These species and the processes they reflect represent a changing nature to the natural world, one in which the natural world's agency and freedom is increasing and is not necessarily predictable or controllable. It probably isn't surprising that it's large predators whose natural tendency to roam is not always tolerated. After a 200-year absence from Denmark, wolves made a return naturally recently, with one being shot earlier this year. Wolves have also begun crossing into the Netherlands and Belgium in the last 3 years, after being reintroduced into Germany. A young, healthy wolf was found dead in the Netherlands recently, apparently hit by a car. Lynx also move across national borders naturally after reintroductions in various countries and from stable populations in others. They don't seem to provoke the same panicked and divided reaction as wolves, but they certainly face their own challenges, such as illegal hunting. When it comes to the UK, this panicked reaction remains very much alive. Last year, a lynx escaped a Welsh zoo and was shot dead. The local council had called in a professional marksman to do the deed after the lynx had been free for 12 days without harming anyone because of fears for the safety of the public. And apparently it was not possible to use tranquilizer darts. A second lynx escaped from the same zoo around the same time and was accidentally strangled by a zookeeper in their attempts to recapture it. Also last year, a farmer said this in response to suggestions for small-scale reintroduction of lynx to the UK of just a few animals. Lynx have not been wild in the UK for over 1,300 years. They are about as native as the dinosaurs were, and they were hunted because they attacked livestock. It will be catastrophic for sheep farming. It turns out that one lynx kills about 0.4 sheep a year, so we can see the power of fear and vested interest very strongly here. Again in the UK, in 2005, the first discussions about reintroducing beavers were scrapped due to intense lobbying by landowners based on the apparent threat that they cause to fisheries, even though beavers are a keystone species that actually improve ecosystems. Some of the arguments also seem to be based on an understanding that the beavers would eat all the fish when they are herbivores. So we see that it's not just international travellers that instill these sorts of reactions, and rewilding isn't just about the autonomy of non-human species to migrate anyway, but is about restoring natural processes and allowing them to develop in their own way more generally. With rewilding projects emerging and developing in Europe and beyond, some with international cooperation and others not, this fear and misunderstanding is something that needs to be addressed. And significant, though variable, resistance to rewilding does persist, something I particularly see in the UK, which probably doesn't surprise you given the examples I've just mentioned. I think some of this is because rewilding has become synonymous with top predators, and this is preventing more in-depth discussions to occur. Those who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo can also easily stoke this apprehension, leaving ears closed to the full picture. Again, I can see the parallels between the challenges of trying to make room for these conversations and the challenges of trying to cut through and counter the government and media portrayals of human migrants, speaking really from a UK perspective, but I think it carries across, where fear is drummed up to further political ambitions and so on. I'm not trying to say that these two things equate perfectly by any means. Of course, there are lots of differences between these two scenarios, but I do think it's interesting to think about. And I think here is one of the ways that public activist art about migration has something to offer any attempts to increase public awareness of and support for rewilding. Ideas can be inserted directly into people's lives in novel and engaging ways that don't force a particular argument but allow people to have direct experiences and come to their own conclusions. Actually, having these types of physical encounters can work to dissipate fear and undermine lines spun elsewhere. Something that appears in familiar spaces but is very much out of place naturally draws our attention and interest, and creative actions can focus in on one aspect of a huge global issue in such a way that they provide an anchor or reference point for those larger discussions. Art, widely speaking, also works on a different register than just conveying factual information. It's visual and engaging and often generates emotive responses which tend to stick with us better in a world where we are continually bombarded with information. I'm not trying to say that experiencing a piece of art will necessarily go on to concrete change, but I think it does have the power to sow a seed, and that seed then needs to be fed and watered in order to grow. Just a couple more examples, hopefully showing how intrigue in something sort of strange in a familiar place might spark new insights for people, even on issues they've heard about lots recently via the news and so on. So, continuing this with this idea of fear again, I think there is also something in how our identities are tangled up with what is familiar, and that can get in the way of us welcoming change for its possibilities. This can make us short-sighted, both in terms of looking forwards but also backwards. The status quo is regarded as the natural order of things, while borders and farming, for example, both represent artificially constructed conditions enforced on once open, wild land. This being the idea of a shifting baseline, which is something that's talked about a lot recently. We can't imagine having wolves back in the UK when there were elephants and hippos here long ago. Of course, that's an extreme example, but on a more relatable level, woodland and other wild spaces are thought to be natural, even when farming and land maintenance has turned them into monocultures, pretty much devoid of life. This is compounded by conservation attempts that sometimes try to freeze such spaces in time, that time being the very recent past. A healthy woodland would have been completely overshadowed by its past formation, and places that we consider natural beauty might be completely devoid of birdsong now, but wouldn't have been in the past. And fish, considered a big catch now, would have been larger and more abundant not that long ago. All of this points towards a need for a lot more conversations and a lot more information out there in the public realm. Just as with human migration, non-human autonomy depends at least partly on shifting public attitudes. For example, a project in Germany that plans to reintroduce lynx has gained support from state and local authorities, local residents, farmers and landowners, showing that it can be achieved. And I think creative projects are well placed to communicate information in a way that allows people space to reflect. And many artists working on issues of climate change have been really successful in generating that reflection and that connection, something which is so important for climate change, as it's a slow-moving process that often operates outside our daily fields of vision. And I'll just show you some examples now. The first is Olafur Eliasson's melting icebergs, which were brought from Greenland and positioned in Paris during COP21. And on a smaller scale, but reflecting the same ideas, are Nele Azevedo's melting figures. Eliasson's icebergs, arranged in a format that resembled a clock and a forum, also allow people to listen to the cracks and creaks of the iceberg fragments melting, as well as witness them melt, this being a potent symbol of climate change. Isaac Cordell has created scenes of officials endlessly discussing climate change while it happens around them. And Pedro Maserati has done something similar in France with his disappearing figures. And I suppose I should mention Banksy as well. He created this simple mural in response to continually missed targets for climate change. Of course, it's not just artists working in public spaces who tackle these issues, but that's what I'm particularly interested in due to its ability to reach everyday people rather than art-going elites. So, something that ties the works that I've just shown you together is their focus on shock. They bring our attention to the negative things that are happening with regards to the environment in a way that they stop being these two big things happening over there and at some time in the future, but become real and immediate and tangible. And this is also a way in to help us get a grip on the enormity of the problem. Obviously, I think this is really important when it comes to climate change. And although rewilding is of course tied up with climate change, I think that it would be of benefit to focus more on the positive ideas of reconnecting with nature. Contemporary environmental artists, as part of a long-standing tradition of land art, often take this approach. Tim Prentice, for example, has this work called Elemental Energy. And Michael McGillis has a whole raft of beautiful outdoor installations. Here, something artificially placed in a natural space somehow draws our attention back to the space itself. The problem with these works is they are not easy to come by, as they're often positioned in rural places, so most people probably only encounter them via photos afterwards. Also, in a way, they aren't conveying anything new, but hoping that we all develop a concern for the things that we already have, which may in turn hopefully stop us destroying them so rapidly. For Rewilding then, the challenge for creative practices is to meld together aspects of all these different approaches. So, they need to be actions in public spaces that are likely to be encountered by numerous people, that use the particularities of one situation in order to open out people's thinking to wider changes, that convey the environmental need for rewilding, but that don't fully focus on shock and negativity, that generate empathy and intrigue through an emotive encounter, but also relate this to information and practical action, that turn the fear of the unknown into excitement for it, that disrupt understandings of what is natural without just relying on straightforward myth-busting techniques. So, this is no small task by any means. Something that might work in its favour is I believe that many of us deep down do hold a fascination with the natural world, and this could be employed to great effect. Engaging the public's imagination here, reigniting that connection to the natural world, might be something that helps shift public attitudes. Thinking about your audience is also really important. So, certain sections of the public are liable to be more reluctant to discussions on rewilding, such as farming communities. And they already are connected to the natural world, or at least what they see as natural. So, here, moving away from discussions on species to the benefits that everyone would see from healthy ecosystems and the possibilities as well for ecotourism might be productive. And here, as well as with many of these creative actions, art can work alongside more traditional methods of awareness raising or campaigning. It could be in the form of something like Greenpeace, who are known for their creative direct actions, and there's a couple on this examples on the screen right now. Or it might just be that artists are there talking to people who've experienced the intervention about the motivations behind it and signposting them to more information. Something the artists I've spoken to say regularly is that they want to activate people. They want to cause that spark of interest. And I think that art has a unique ability to do that. And when it comes to the more general population, I think visual arts could be a really productive way of allowing people to envision wilder futures. I think that for many, that will involve bringing nature to people, whether it's through VR headsets or participatory actions, or perhaps creating a mini woodland in a public square, or collaborations with wildlife parks, or any other ways that people can directly experience these realities. Taking lynxes out into public squares might be difficult, but I would love to figure out a way to do something like that, so that people can see what lynx really are and learn about them. So, in my abstract, I refer to this paper as a call to action to think outside the box in order to secure a wilder future. This means I haven't got any concrete answers, but I hope it has been somewhat interesting or useful in terms of thinking about what the arts could potentially do to communicate perhaps the projects that you're working on or some of these bigger campaigns and issues. And if anyone is interested and does want to think more about it, please do get in touch with me. I'm really keen to start putting into practice the things that I've been researching about for the last 3 years. Thank you very much, and I'm really excited to see everybody else's presentations. Bye.